Okay, so a little history. So early on with society in the United States, really health was uh, a concern as it relates to life and death. So if we start looking at the contemporary for the time issues with causes of death, there's a lot of things that go into harsh working conditions and accessibility to health resources and those sorts of things. But primarily, the biggest public health concern early on in U.S. history revolved around infectious disease. And much of that is a result of lack of understanding of those diseases in terms of, causality, identifying, the appropriate pathogens and coming up with a control measure. Um, and this semester, teaching this course, especially in the midst of COVID-19, I think we can all appreciate the kind of the situation that happened early on in public health history with regard to infectious disease, right? Having an infectious agent that impacts health, that contributes to mortality, and not having um, a therapeutic type of response to that infectious disease can be very unnerving. What we're dealing with today, as far as controlling COVID-19, um, was probably the most appropriate measures that were available to deal with infectious disease in our history. So basically, without a vaccine, without widespread treatment, really the only thing to protect us from developing the condition is to avoid the pathogen. So early on, you saw the stay-at-home orders. You still see quarantine and isolation being used when there has been suspected transmission. That's basically what they were dealing with early on. And as a result of that, um, mortality rates in the U.S., the contributory causes to that were most likely infectious disease. Now, if you look at how infectious disease has impacted mortality rate year to year in the U.S., you'll see that early on it starts out as being the most significant contributor to mortality. You go along in history, you'll see a big spike in 1918. That was the flu pandemic, right? Back in 1918, there was no flu vaccination. So it's very similar. It parallels what we have with COVID. Basically, they're trying to do the same things, getting people to isolate, social distance, wear masks. And they dealt with the same issues we're dealing with today, where people start to get fatigued over how drawn out these measures have been put in place. And again, there's a lot of similarities between what happened then and what's happening now. All right, but in that case, we're dealing with seasonal influenza. You see this big spike in fatalities that occur over that year period, and then things kind of return to a non-pandemic type of situation. Still contributes to a lot of the mortality. Again, and that's because infectious diseases, there's no immunizations, no vaccinations, there's no appropriate treatments. And until we get to about the mid 1940s, with the kind of the advent of penicillin, right, a very powerful antibiotic, at that point now we have a mechanism in which to deal with bacterial infections. And as a result of that, other scientific breakthroughs are developed, new treatments, cures, immunizations. All that starts to get ramped up through public health delivery systems, and you start to see infectious disease year after year become a decreasing contributor to population mortality. And we go through a couple decades in the 50s and 60s where infectious disease really isn't, I gotta be careful how I say this, um, it's not the major concern in terms of population health, because we're able to address infectious disease from a therapeutic standpoint. Now, as we get into the 1970s, we start to see an uptick in mortalities due to infectious disease. And if we go back and we look at, well, what was contributing to that uptick, we see that it's namely drug-resistant tuberculosis. Drug-resistant tuberculosis is kind of parallels some of the issues and concerns we have today. It's where the bacteria that causes tuberculosis starts to adapt to the antibiotic therapies. And what emerges out of that is a pathogen that is resistant to those contemporary antibiotics at the time, and it contributes to a mortality rate increase. But still remains relatively stable until we get to the mid 80s, and then we see HIV become a public health infectious disease concern. Now, I used to use an example in my health promotion class to my undergraduate students, talking to them about, and here I was really trying to emphasize the non-communicable disease mortality rates, things related to lifestyle, trying to emphasize that point. And I always pose the question, do any of you wake up in the morning thinking that there's this contagious disease out there that could potentially jeopardize your health, maybe even resulting in death? And the answer has always been no, and we've gotten kind of comfortable with that. But since COVID, okay, now that situation changes. So I think it's really helpful for us to imagine ourselves back before there were these therapeutic treatments and immunizations, before they were available, how much of an impact that had on daily lives in the U.S. I think we can kind of appreciate what they went through. Okay, so by being able to control infectious disease mortality, how that impacted life expectancy, right? So life expectancy increases over this time period, approximately 29.7 years. That's a tremendous amount of increase. But when you think about life expectancy and how it's calculated, right? It's a simple average. You just take the age at time of death and you average them all together and divide by the number of people that died. You come up with a life expectancy. So what's happening there is, one, you have people living longer, right? So that's going to raise life expectancy. But you also have people that aren't dying prematurely, right? Anytime someone dies prematurely and they fall in that premature age falls below the average, you're going to bring that average down. So a combination of things occurred over that time. Now, if we look at life expectancy, right, it's approximately 79 years in the U.S. If we compare that with other developed countries, right, we see that it's not really that high of a standard. We're not in the top 10. Okay, if we look at life expectancy, we're in the 50s. And we're dropping as other countries are increasing their life expectancy, but there's still room for improvement. Now we have to look at, okay, well, since we got a handle on infectious disease mortality, what's driving this? Well, now we're seeing mortality being impacted by non-communicable disease, right? Those lifestyle diseases, things like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, right? Those types of things you can't transmit from person to person, but there is a number of individuals within the population that have these conditions, and it does result in premature death again. And think about how that impacts overall life expectancy. It brings it down. So now we shift gears to the health promotion era in 1974. This is in the U.S. And there was a lot of momentum to take on a preventive role in a lot of different areas. In the 70s, we see the emergence of the Clean Water Act, right, the Clean Air Act, federal laws that reflect a federal agenda to prevent these public health problems from getting bigger. And that prevention strategy kind of translates over into population health and the emergence of health promotion. I have a document in the Module 1 folders looking at the Lalonde report in Canada. Lalonde was the Prime Minister of Health, or the Minister of Health in Canada. Basically commissioned a study to look at, what were the significant contributors to population health, right? If we want to improve population health, what are some of the things we should be looking at? And you can go through that document and kind of see what he settled on. But ultimately, what emerged as the most significant contributor to population health was lifestyle or behavior selection. Here in the U.S., we have the Health Information and Health Promotion Act, and that led to the development of the Office of Health Information, which later becomes what is known as now the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. That office falls under the guidance of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They're the ones that produce the Healthy People document. And one of the things I want to say about that, just recently, I believe it was August 18th, they released Healthy People 2030. And I'll talk about Healthy People here in a little bit. But basically, it's the agenda, the United States agenda for population health over a 10-year span. We are concluding Healthy People 2020 this year. So, the rollout of Healthy People 2030, we usually do that early so you can kind of get a start on that. But I just want to mention that because in one of the assessments I have you reflect on Healthy People 2020. You could use Healthy People 2030 data as well, and I'll address that in the assignment itself. Okay, so in the 20th century, again, we're emerging, or we're getting a handle on how to deal with infectious disease, but chronic disease in terms of non-communicable, that starts to take over as the major contributor to mortality. And some of the health behaviors that were identified as being especially problematic were tobacco use, lack of physical activity, poor eating habits, excess alcohol consumption. Now, one thing I want to mention at this point is whenever we talk about health behaviors, and you see that word behaviors, we're talking about actions, right? These are things that people can do or not do. They're verbs. So in terms of tobacco use, okay, that's a behavior that's going to most likely result in a health condition that ultimately produces mortality. I believe there's a slide coming up where we can kind of bounce back and forth and kind of illustrate this point. But the main point I want you to have at this moment is recognizing that behaviors are actions. Okay. Okay, again, Healthy People, again, that's the document that I was talking about, comes out of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. Like I said, currently there's a Healthy People 2030, but we're still wrapping up Healthy People 2020. And it's a collaboration among various health organizations to identify, okay, well, what are the steps or to be taken to improve the current health status of the population. And they do so through a collection of objectives and goals. And it's kind of hit or miss. Like you think that, okay, if we set up goals for a 10-year period, we should be able to achieve those goals. Um, and the reality is that while we do have a plan and there are objectives and they're measurable objectives and they're laid out, um, a lot of them are very difficult to achieve. So when you look at the goals of Healthy People 2030, you're going to see some similarities between the goals that were laid out for Healthy People 2020, simply because they are difficult to achieve. For example, uh, one of the goals that appears in Healthy People 2020 that is extended to Healthy People 2030, and by the way, was present in Healthy People 2010, is the elimination of health disparities. And health disparities are simply differences in health status between groups or among groups. For example, if we look at racial groupings, and we use the census racial categories, white, black, Hispanic. If we were to look at those groups and look at health status between those groups, you're going to see there's some differences. For example, infant mortality rates, right? So this would be a death that occurs within the first year of life. You're going to see that the rate is nearly double among blacks than it is among whites. And again, what Healthy People 2020 to Healthy People 2030 is setting out to do is that, well, we need to eliminate that disparity, right? There shouldn't be a difference in infant mortality rates simply as a matter of race. And hopefully, as we go through the semester, you'll see that it's not a simple matter of race. There is a lot of confounding issues that contribute to why one racial group experiences a different health status than another, that goes way beyond simply the physical characteristic, the phenotype of race, right? A lot goes into like socioeconomic status, access to health care, those sorts of things. But again, that is the agenda of the U.S. over the next 10 years. And so it contributes to the various policies that will be generated at all levels of government. Again, in order to achieve or meet those goals. Okay, so going forward in the 21st century, right, we still carry over a lot of the same issues from the 20th century. And we see the reemergence of an issue that the potential has always been there, and I'm talking about COVID, for an infectious disease to run rampant if there is no measures to alleviate the pathogen. Right, the only thing you have, there's a chain of infection model that's out there, and basically it's represented by links in a chain. It begins with the pathogen. The idea is that it illustrates how the pathogen is transmitted from person to person. And the idea is that, well, you simply have to break one of the links in the chain in order to prevent transmission. For example, beginning with a pathogen, if there is some type of antibiotic or viral treatment, right, that could eliminate the pathogen, a vaccine, for example, okay, that would break that link. Otherwise, you have to use things like isolation and quarantines. We're talking about a physical transmission. How do we prevent that? Right? That's where you see, the plexiglass barriers, the face masks, the social distancing. Right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to break that link of pathogen to host, and then from host to other people. Now, I don't know if that has shown up in any of the objectives in Healthy People 2030, since it was so recently released. I don't know if they had time to address that. that's something that we can explore as the semester goes through to see if that was addressed. But primarily we're focused on behavioral change. And even with infectious disease, behavior certainly is something that still applies. Um, but you know, one of the things that we'll learn is that you're asking people to make behavior changes, and we have to recognize the difficulty um, that goes along with changing a behavior. Even if we look within ourselves and identify some positive health behaviors we'd like to change in our own lives, well, if you can think of behaviors that you could change that would improve your health, right, the next question is, okay, well, why haven't you made those behavioral changes? It's because behavior change is difficult. And we have to keep that in mind when we're asking individuals or groups to make behavior changes. But if we can do that, the link between the behavior and the health outcome is established. So if you change the health behavior, then you would expect to see a change in the health outcome. Now, in order to make a behavior change, remember these are actions, they're verbs. So you need to be able to explain um, why it's important to make the behavior change. Because we're dealing with actions, you may need to instruct individuals on how to carry out the behavior change. For example, if you were promoting strength and conditioning as the behavior change, well, a lot of the strength and conditioning programs and exercises, right, involves technique. And in order to maximize the benefit of the strength and conditioning program, right, the person has to follow proper technique. Well, you're going to have to come up with a way to explain that, so that your population understands that. Now, if we look here on the slides, it says health information to be understood by the average person. That is very difficult, because what is the average person in terms of level of understanding? There's certainly readability issues, right? Developing a factually correct source of information that contains a lot of scientific jargon um, may not be the best approach. Again, if your audience, your target audience, doesn't understand or comprehend the language that's being used. So, there's certainly going to be a readability index to consider. The examples that you use, right? They should be relevant to the specific population that you're trying to inform. So, because of that consideration and the knowledge, expertise that's required, we have to ensure that our health professionals that are designated to deliver that information do so in a way that allows the target population to remain informed enough to make the appropriate decisions with regard to managing their health, and specifically changing their behaviors. Okay, so now we see a comparison of two charts here. So on the left we see the most common causes of death, and that's simply a tally of cause-specific death as reported on the death certificate. Right. So any given year, so this one happens to be 2013 data. The total number of people that died from heart disease, right, was the largest group. So that's how it gets ranked as number one. Malignant neoplasms or cancer is two, and so on and so forth. Now, if we go over to the right, this study was conducted using 2000 data, and I haven't seen it replicated since then. But what they attempted to do was not look at the condition which ultimately, caused death, but what led up to the development of that condition. Right. So now we're starting to look at more behavior related outcomes. So again, 2000s, tobacco was very significant, but there have been a lot of changes, uh, especially in terms of the social norm that probably has decreased the number of people that use tobacco. So I would expect that to have fallen down the list. How far, your guess is as good as mine. It's probably still near the top. It may be number two, number three, but actually, number two. That is probably, if this study were to be replicated, I would bargain, or I would wager that poor diet and physical inactivity has taken over, because typically results in obesity issues. There's a number of health issues that go along with obesity, like heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, those types of things. In fact, I'll see if I can find the resource, but I think the expectations were that the life expectancy in the U.S. Should be much higher than it is, because of the declining numbers of people that use tobacco. But that increase was held back by the obesity epidemic that seems to impact um, our population more and more. So, but the this particular chart here, this illustration, really points out that, okay, if you were to put together a program to decrease heart disease and cancer, the question is, okay, well, where do I start? How do I even begin to decrease those causes of death? Well, you're going to have to look at the behaviors that are associated with those health outcomes. And that's what's going on with these actual causes of death. Looking at tobacco use, right? Looking at um, diet and physical activity levels. Okay, now we can build a program around getting people to change those behaviors. Um, Again, with the same end result, right? Decrease mortality rate due to heart disease and cancer, so on and so forth. All right, now we'll spend some time kind of differentiating. And notice I'm using the word differentiating. I want to make sure you understand the difference between health education and health promotion. So we have a definition here of health education. You'll see down here in the reference, Joint Committee 2012. And the Joint Committee is basically, the most recent one we're looking at, is the American Association for Health Education, AHE, and they were part of a group called AFERD. AFERD was kind of restructured to become something else, and I believe AHE is now part of SOPHE, the Society of Public Health Educators. But anyway, so the Joint Committee, and their official title is Joint Committee on Health Education and Promotion Terminology. Um, Basically, sat down and looked at the terminology that's used within the field of health promotion, and attempts to take some of the ambiguity out of the terms. For example, there's a lot of ambiguity with the term health promotion. And it gets to a point where people tend to use health education and health promotion interchangeably. But really, there's a distinction. So if we look at this definition of health education, right, using evidence-based practices, and you can read through those, but really it's increasing knowledge about health topics. Okay, and I see the utility of health education, but it's simply a tool that falls within health promotion. Now, it's a pretty big tool. There's always going to be a need to expand knowledge, especially when it comes to behavior change. Right? There's a segment of the population out there, when you ask them to improve their diet. Right? They may agree with you. Yeah, that sounds like a good thing to do, but they may not know how to go about that, right? They may not know the difference between macronutrients and micronutrients. Um, if you were to deliver a health education module on um, carbohydrates, um, you know, they may not understand what you're talking about when you say carbohydrate, or you say, well, you need a protein, either animal or plant-based. Again, may not understand. So health education is going to be needed there to bring them up to speed. Um, with portion sizes, right? Telling someone they need to eat, 12 grams of protein. Okay, well, now that you explain to me what proteins are, I know what that is, but I can't really wrap my head around 12 grams. How much? How large is that? So you see a lot of these infographic type health education ads to, X grams of protein is about the size of a stack of playing cards, right? So a person can relate to that. But those efforts, again, contribute to how well you can increase their knowledge through health education, right? So that's what health education is. Health promotion, however, is basically, it's almost like marketing. Um, so say you're trying to sell your target population on a behavior change. We need to look at what resources do I have available, or what channels do I have available in order to really promote this idea of changing the behavior, and to create a situation that's most conducive to them being successful in the behavior change. Now, certainly you will have to increase knowledge, right? So health education will play an important role, but we can also look at other areas, political, um, regulatory, looking at, are there laws that can be put into place, like seatbelt laws, right? That's a behavior, wearing your seatbelt. Well, that behavior, I think, is more widespread in this country because there are seatbelt laws, right? At some point, they determine that it's not enough just to tell people to wear their seatbelts, explain to them why they need to wear their seatbelts. People still weren't doing it, right? Behavior change is difficult. So now we compel them to wear their seatbelts through, penalties and consequences. Not my favorite method, because I feel it's a slippery slope, and freedom of choice is something that we should preserve. But you have to look at, we're trying to improve overall population health, and there are going to be groups of individuals that may not be on board with it, but the greater good, the benefits there. It's a difference between malfeasance and beneficence. Organizational mechanisms. Our daily routines often fall within an organization. My organization, for example, would be FAU. Uh, what is the organization doing for me to help me improve my health? Right? And there's certainly a lot of programs available. They have a recreation center on campus that's accessible. There are different programs that I can be a part of simply because I'm a member of the organization. So we can do things like that. Environmental. We don't operate in a vacuum. We operate within an environmental situation. For example, if you live in an area that has a lot of sidewalks and parks and outdoor spaces, well, you have more opportunities to engage in physical activity than someone that lives in an area that doesn't have those things, right? So environmental changes are things that we can do. So health promotion is really that, using all these different channels to, again, create a situation that's most conducive to the behavior change to ultimately produce an improvement in health outcome. So here's a graphic that represents this. And I like this graphic because it does emphasize the importance of health education, but it also includes all the other factors that we can utilize in order to, again, create that situation that makes it easier for a person to make the behavior changes. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is this health education specialist. Okay, so a health education specialist is a description that's supported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's BLS.gov, and basically, as long as there's a professional category, BLS will provide resources, give you insight on job growth, kind of list qualification, list standards to fall within that particular job classification. So, Joint Committee, they also kind of worked on kind of tightening up the definition of a health education specialist. So, in there, you see things like minimum criteria, right? At the minimum, have a bachelor's level in health related field. Serves in a variety of settings, right? Whether it's academic, private industry, um, communities. Able to use appropriate educational strategy. So at some point they're going to define, well, what is appropriate. They're going to list out the standardizations there. Methods to facilitate development of policies, right? So maybe we need to advocate for government intervention or regulatory intervention, or even just naming a policy and having that on an organization's agenda that they're always working towards, right? How do we go about establishing that? Um, Prior to health education specialist, again, they used to be called health educators, community health workers, and what we found that really wasn't appropriate to describe what a health education specialist does. So again, we're moving towards more clearly defining the occupation. Now, with health education specialists, there's a variety of settings, right? So schools, looking at childhood health, especially from a behavioral perspective. What we know about behaviors is that momentum, inertia, plays a big role. So, in other words, the longer a person has been engaged in a behavior, right, the more likely they are to keep that behavior. So, if we can establish healthy behavior adoption at earlier ages, right, they're more likely to maintain those behaviors over the course of their lifetime. Now, the problem is this also applies to bad behaviors, right? So, the analogy would be smokers, right? The longer a person has been a smoker, the more difficult it's going to be to get them to change that behavior. Um, but we want that applied to, if someone early on adopts a physically active lifestyle, like the longer they maintain that, longer that's part of the routine, the more likely are to kind of maintain that lifestyle again over the course of lifetime. Community health agencies, right? Some more localized agencies that are focused on community health, right? So they're governmental and non-governmental. A lot of nonprofits fall into this. Work sites. Work sites are a tremendous opportunity to impact behavior change. I've been a part of several worksite health promotion programs, and the thing you need to focus on is that in the early stages of behavior change, you're really relying on repetition and consistency. So with the new behaviors, right, you get a person to repeat that behavior, come up with a schedule to engage in that behavior. It's going to assist them with getting to a point where they can maintain that behavior change on their own. So work sites, because again, like schools, right? We know where you're going to be between certain hours on certain days. We can plan around that so that we can deliver interventions during those time periods, again, to get that consistency and repetition. Healthcare settings. So, for example, when someone's diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, they're probably going to be referred to a health education specialist to talk about, okay, well, what are some of the changes in diet? What are some of the changes in physical activity? There's certainly going to be some behavioral changes directly related to the diagnoses. Right, there's probably going to be medications prescribed, right? So the person has to, know when to take those medications. If insulin injections are part of their prescription, right? How to administer the injections. What are some symptoms of side effects to look out for, so that they can, address those as they come up. So there really is a tremendous opportunity for health education specialists to enter into a field and enter into a setting that they're comfortable with. Okay, levels of prevention. All right, so levels of prevention. This is probably going to be our first kind of step into looking at tailoring our approach to the needs, specific needs of the target population. So this idea of preventive strategies, they can be more specific, again, to align with characteristics or needs of that target population. Okay, for example, with primary prevention, this is probably what you typically think of when someone mentions prevention programs. This is designed to reach individuals that are healthy. They're not engaging in unhealthy behaviors. They don't have any physiological adaptations that result from poor behavior. Right, and basically, we don't want a behavior change. We want them to continue doing what they're doing. And those programs designed with primary prevention in mind are going to look different than secondary prevention and tertiary prevention, right? So secondary prevention, we're trying to engage those individuals that, maybe do require a behavior change, right? So maybe they started experimenting with drugs, or they're consuming alcohol, and we don't want to get to a point where it becomes excessive consumption. So really what you want to do is get in and help them either manage those behaviors, or maybe even change those behaviors if they so desire. And the idea is that we can do so before their health status becomes too impacted, or before they even develop a health issue. So the examples and the materials and the education that we use in secondary prevention programs, right, wouldn't be appropriate to deliver to those that would be better served by primary prevention. Now, the third group, tertiary prevention, that's designed to reach individuals that they have a health condition. They've been engaged in these behaviors for a long period of time. They can still see some benefit by changing those behaviors, but really we focus on helping them become informed to better manage their existing conditions. Maybe it's a situation where we can reverse the condition, or maybe it's a situation where, well, they're not likely to be cured of the condition, but they can certainly manage that condition in a way to you know minimize their impact on their quality of life and daily routines. But the idea here really is to just illustrate that prevention needs to be specific to the needs of the target population. So your prevention program is going to have a different identity depending on what those needs are and what groups you're working with. Okay, continuing on with talking about health education specialists. Okay, so um, as Health educators was more of a generic role. Basically, if it was a health related situation and you're brought in to inform the group, right, you're kind of labeled as a health educator. Um, no matter if you had been in the field for 20 years, you were quite advanced at your approach to delivering health education, or someone that was just starting out, basically just all kind of fell under that role. In 1979, the role delineation project was basically kind of brought about to, again, to solidify the professional nature of the health education specialist, and to distinguish between entry level health educators and those that have more experience, more academic preparation, and those sorts of things. So in 1985, we have 7 areas of responsibility. Basically, if you want to fall under this professional category, right here are the areas of responsibility that you need to maintain. Again, generic to all entry level health educators, but it's a first step into kind of solidifying the classification. 1997, 3 additional areas of responsibility were added to designate advanced level health educators. In between 1998 and 2004, series of competencies called the CUP Competencies Update Project, again re-verified for entry level and advanced level, again making a distinction. And then in 2010, we come up with this framework to basically capture what a health educator is. So if we look at 2015, a competency-based framework, I'll just say framework here, was a result of the health education specialist practice analysis. So again, they're looking at the entire field, seeing what competencies a person needs to possess in order to make that jump to advanced levels. And basically, they came up with 258 sub-competencies that fall under 36 competencies. In March of this year, they redid the study, right? And it's the HEPSA 2. And basically they worked on kind of narrowing down the sub competencies. They reduced competencies by one, made it 35, but and then had 193 sub competencies within that. Okay, continuing on. So the framework, again, to kind of describe what a health education specialist is, we see some acronyms here. NCHEC, that's the National Commission for Health Education Credentialing. NCAPE, more related to CAPE, Council for the Accreditation of Educator Prep. Basically, it helps to define the curriculum for people to become educators. SAPAC, that's I see a typo there. It should be SAPAC at the end of number one, but that is the SOFI AHI Baccalaureate Program Approval Commission. Basically looking at college level curriculum in terms of health education. And then you had the National Commission for Health Education Credentialing. Now, NCHEC is basically oversees the CHES and the MCHES designations. So the CHES, the Certified Health Education Specialist, that's something where, I guess MCHES is the same thing. The only difference between the two is MCHES requires a period of experience to be applied to the designation, and kind of recognizes that you have those years of experience when you have that designation. I considered MCHES early on, but one of the things that you need to think about is, will the MCHES elevate your position in your terms of employment or your professional identity? Certainly, having MCHES is something that can contribute to that. but there's also a requirement for you to maintain your certification in terms of continuing education. And again, I just say this as a side note. Another thing to consider is how to maintain those continuing education, the difference between a CHES and the MCHES. And one of the things that I noticed was that, so say you went to a SOFI conference, there's going to be a number of presentations that are delivered over the course of the conference. Some of the courses are going to be designated as CHES eligible or MCHES eligible, meaning that uh, you provide documentation that you attended the presentation, and that's going to count towards you know the number of CEUs you have to get over each 5-year period. And one of the things that I found was that while there will be a number of CHES eligible presentations being delivered, there's very few MCHES. And at the time, I felt that I'd rather go see presentations that I was more interested in rather than I go to attend a presentation simply because I need the continuing education to maintain the MCHES. So it's a decision if you want to pursue those credentials, but you need to consider the totality of the issue. Again, just my 2 cents on that. Um, so another thing to consider is that if organizations, in the case colleges and universities, if they want to deliver their curriculum, right, there are standards that they can align with. Okay, so on the left we have areas of responsibility for health education specialists, um, and on the right we have those areas, but they've been updated in March of 2020, and you'll notice that they have increased, right? So there's 8 areas now where there were 7. Now they're essentially the same thing. Um, right, so we have plan, health, education slash promotion. Area 2 of here is planning, right? So it's implement. It goes down through. Um, but the thing that was added was the area 8, ethics and professionalism. So now there's a responsibility that if you are going to be a health education specialist, there are certain guidelines in terms of ethics, right? And because we're dealing with people, we always have to consider the ethical decisions that occur in that interaction. So they just wanted to reaffirm that everyone is being treated ethically within these programs. Okay, some assumptions of health promotion. So the whole idea of health promotion can only work within these assumptions. Okay, so basically we're justifying the significance of health promotion. Okay, so the first one is health status can be changed. Now, I don't think that needs to be a hard and fast type of an assumption, meaning that, well, I'm working with a group, they're terminally ill, right? Their status is not going to change, so we wouldn't expose them to health promotion. I'm not on board with that. I think ultimately health status is an important part of our lives, but I think even more important than health status is this idea of quality of life. And if we can improve someone's quality of life, no matter what their health status is, I still think there's a benefit, and health promotion can play a role. Um, Second assumption: health and disease are dynamic. Basically, what they're saying is that they interact. Right, disease can kind of impact our interpretation of health and what we recognize as health. Disease theories and principles can be understood. So, if it's an infectious disease, do we need to know the mechanism by which it works? If it's a non-infectious disease, do we understand, how those diseases come about and how we can, potentially reverse or mitigate those diseases, right? So we have to understand kind of the mechanism because we're going to design programs around that mechanism. Appropriate prevention strategies can be developed. So, in terms of primary, secondary, or tertiary, right? Are there things that we can do that can help the person manage their behaviors in a way that's going to optimize their potential for a health outcome? The next one, behavior can be changed, and in those changes can impact health. So behaviors, for the most part, can be changed, but we want to focus on behaviors that are associated with the health issue that we're interested in. And that can be very broad. So, say we're talking about sexually transmitted infections, right? I'm sure a lot of you can come up with, the appropriate behaviors we need to focus on if we want to minimize the likelihood that someone is going to develop a sexually transmitted infection, right? And a lot of those behaviors are going to center around sexual intercourse, protection, abstinence, those types of things. But there's also behaviors that maybe play an indirect role, looking at substance abuse, excessive alcohol consumption, right? Because those behaviors can put someone in a situation that may result in transmission of a STI. So, again, we want to identify those behaviors, and we want to be, clear in our understanding of the link between the behavior and the health issue. And go up to the top of the next column. Many things contribute to health and influence behavior change. Absolutely, right? Think about, so we're working with people to change their dietary behaviors, right? And we go through the health education, explain to them, well, here are the healthy options. Here's, we can work on their skill development, healthy food preparation technique. One of the things that I ran into in my previous institution, we went out into the rural community and did a grocery store audit. Worked with some extension agents in the nutrition program, and they would go out and they would hold seminars and teach healthy food prep demonstrations and those types of things. Well, the follow through was, well, let's go to the grocery stores that they tend to use. And in one of the grocery stores we found that, for example, with ground beef, it was just ground beef, right? It was a 70-30 blend. So the extension agents were going out there talking about, if you're using hamburger, we'll select the 95-5 or the 90-10 blend to reduce fat. Well, the individuals, when they went to their local grocery store, they weren't able to purchase that particular blend. So, you know, that's something you need to think about. Like, what is their environment? Is their environment conducive to like the behaviors that they're trying to change? The next one, initiating and maintaining behavior change is difficult. I kind of talked about this earlier. That's absolutely the case even for ourselves, and we want to make a positive behavior change. It's still very difficult. We need to keep that in mind, and again, help the person make the behavior change instead of just telling them, here's the behaviors you need to change, now go out and do it, right? Just understand that it's going to be difficult, and what can we do to ease that transition. Individual responsibility should not be viewed as victim blaming. Victim blaming, that's where you're blaming the person for being in the situation that they're in. And we need to be cognizant that, okay, yes, if we're dealing with adults, ultimately they have the responsibilities for their actions or inactions. But I think we also need to step back and look at, well, is everybody starting from the same position in terms of behavior change, right? Working with a group of individuals that don't smoke, okay? Now, maybe we look into their situation, right? They come from a household where, both parents don't smoke. They live in a community where there's not a lot of advertisements for tobacco products. There's They live in an area where to most places are smoke free, or all places are smoke free. I don't think that person is going to have the same challenges of not smoking as someone that does come from a household where one or both parents smoke, where siblings smoke, where they see people smoking in their neighborhood. They see advertisements in convenience stores for tobacco products. Okay, so just recognizing that it's not, situations are different, and those differences can contribute to difficulties with changing behaviors. I just think we need to have an open mind about that. And then the last one, for behavior change to be permanent, here's where I was talking about repetition and consistency. Right, that we want to get them to a point where the healthy behaviors become a part of their normal lifestyle. Um, but you have to recognize that you can use laws and regulations and to force people into engaging or not engaging in certain behaviors. But if they're not motivated to actually carry out those changes, then the motivation can't strictly come from, you know, being told this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you're not allowed to do. Because any situation they find themselves in where that authority doesn't apply, well, they're probably not going to follow through with the behavior change that we're asking. Um, and this last part, ready to change. When we get to talking about theories, we'll talk about stages of change. And stages of change basically recognizes that when you say, okay, let's make this health behavior change, there's going to be an entire spectrum of your population that falls into different categories in terms of readiness to make that change, and you're going to have to adapt or address each of those categories if you want to move the entire group through the behavior change equitably. Okay, so now talking about program planning, which is what this course is all about. So planning, you always have to begin with, okay, well, what do you want your outcome to be? You have to have a clear picture of your outcome. The analogy would be, if you're driving your car, right? You want to start your trip knowing where your destination is going to be. That allows you an opportunity to decide what the best route to that destination is going to be. Okay, so similar to that with program planning, but we want to know, okay, what's the ultimate outcome? Then we can come up with a proposal or a plan of how to get there, right? So that means that each step that you take towards that outcome, right, you want to put thought and consideration into it and say, is this the appropriate decision or activity or strategy to undertake, and is that going to move me closer to my outcome? Planning help make the program transparent. Okay, you guys are going to develop a program plan, and I'm also going to have you develop a logic model. And the idea is that the logic model represents your plan in totality. And you can show that to interested individuals, and they can at a glance see, okay, here's the steps that you're taking, here's what your outcome that you're shooting for. Okay, I can see kind of what you're doing. um, you'll see this term here, stakeholders, right? These are people that just have some vested interest in your outcome or the population that you're working with. So they may be protective of that population and just want to make sure that what you're proposing to do kind of aligns with kind of their values and their missions and that sort of thing. So by having a program plan, right, you're basically outlining kind of what your interaction is going to be. Okay, planning is empowering. Okay, so once you develop your plan, and I've been a part of several different projects where we've had a plan. We worked on the plan. We've gone met with the stakeholder, met with the decision makers, kind of sold our plan to them. But really, with decision makers, right, whether they're deciding whether it's a go or no go, So you have this wonderful plan, but it just simply sits there until whoever the decision makers are, right, agree that or approve your plan to be implemented. Okay, but once they say yes, now your role becomes different. Now you're implementing the plan, you're administering the plan, um, and that's what they mean by empowering. Right now you have control over your destiny in terms of meeting your outcome. And then finally, planning creates alignment. Especially if this happens within an organization, and most of these plans will happen within some organization, whether it's a university, a work site, a community. But basically, um, by seeing the plan, other members of the organization can see where they fit into that plan. Right? They say, okay, well, here's a strategy that involves advertising and promoting the plan so that we can recruit. Well, there may be a marketing department within your organization, and that marketing department says, oh, okay, here's where we would fit in. They can recognize, oh, we wouldn't really be an appropriate fit in the evaluation component of the plan, but in the marketing component of the plan, yeah, we're on board with that. So again, it just helps draw in additional resources simply based on other arms of the organization recognizing where they can contribute. Okay, the generalized model for program planning. So this is basically the generic version of program planning. Um, we're going to focus on pre-seed proceed model. We'll discuss that more as we go on, but it's basically starts with this basic framework. So these five elements need to be a part of every plan, but you can certainly build upon these elements. So the first thing we need to do is assessing the needs. So once you identify your target population, right, you've kind of delineated who you're going to be working with. So now you can focus on their particular characteristics and their specific needs. Okay. Um, if you skip this step and you just come up with program idea, okay, here's what I think would improve the situation. You may introduce some benefit to the group, but if you sit down, take the time to actually assess what the actual needs are and develop a program specific to those needs, then the assurance of you coming in and benefiting the target population is a little more sound. Okay, so once you assess the needs, you need to go through a process and decide, okay, well, what needs can we address, right? There may be some things that are beyond the scope of your program. So you really want to focus on what your program planning group can actually address. And again, remember I said that, if you're driving a car, you need to know what your final destination is. Well, here's where you're establishing what your final destination is by setting your goal. Your goal is going to be your ultimate outcome. Okay, at the end of when the program ends, here's what I want to have achieved. Objectives, on the other hand, are things that occur during program implementation that each time you meet an objective, it's like taking a step closer to your goal. So, and we'll spend a lot of time looking at objectives and how to go about constructing objectives in a way that, again, each time you meet an objective, you're advancing towards your goal. Okay, so once you have your final destination, you've identified your objectives, and we're going to develop measurable objectives along the way. But based on that, you're going to develop your intervention. Okay, and this simply means you're trying to figure out how you're going to meet each of the objectives. So, for example, if you have an objective that has four basic elements, who the objective applies to, what's being changed, how much of a change, and by when. So what if we say by the end of the semester, um, students at FAU, 50% of students at FAU will have increased their levels of physical activity. Okay, well, how are you going to do that? Right, that's where your program plan comes into play. Right, your intervention starts to develop. It arises out of your collection of objectives. Now, it's interesting to me that they separated out implementing the intervention. I know that health educators and health promotion people, worked on this, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But implementing the intervention simply means you take your plan, you put it into play. Um, if you're not in the health education, health promotion field, right, you may think, oh, that should probably fall under developing your intervention. Of course, you don't develop something unless you plan on, deploying it and running it. But the reason why I call out why this is separated is that implementing your plan um, isn't always straightforward. I would go on and say it's never straightforward. It's very difficult to put your plan into action and for it to run smoothly. It's because you're dealing with people. You're dealing with real life situations that could impact your ability to follow your plan, right? Your plan may be excellent, right? It's thorough, it's well thought out, it's uses the latest, scientific understanding of human behavior and how those behaviors are associated with health, and it's excellent. But then when you recruit people and you run them through your program, there's all sorts of things that could come up that could stop your plan in its tracks. For example, I had a graduate student that she had noticed, quite a few young ladies within her church congregation. Um, they were single and pregnant, some young teenagers, and she thought, maybe I could come up with a faith-based program um, to help prevent unplanned pregnancies. I thought, yeah, that's an excellent idea, right? So she worked on the plan. She was going to deliver it uh, in her church, using some church space for these ladies to meet and kind of talk about issues, that sort of thing. And everything was going well until she got to one of the components in her plan that discussed using barrier protection during sex. And once some of the clergy got wind of that, they were kind of like, well, this isn't something that we feel should be kind of discussed, you know, within the church. Um, at that point, her intervention stopped until she found a suitable space to kind of deliver these components. But that's one of the things that on paper, yeah, it made sense. It kind of fit into the curriculum that she had designed. But when she went to implement it in a real world setting, there were certain concerns that impacted her ability to deliver that program. So implementing the intervention is a big deal. And then finally, evaluating the results. Um, that's the one thing that I don't like about this generalized model of program planning is that it's a linear model, and evaluating the results, it kind of appears at the end. But what it implies is that you don't worry about evaluation until your program's ended. And I've been asked to evaluate different programs, but I've been brought in at the end and saying, okay, here's our data. Can you evaluate, tell us if, was a program successful or not? Well, at that point, I'm limited to what data were collected. Um, Evaluating the results actually occurs at setting goals and objectives. Remember, I mentioned we'll be creating measurable objectives. Well, at that point, that's where your evaluation plan starts to form. And during the implementation, as you meet these objectives, and since they're measurable objectives, right, you're going to be collecting data. There's no reason why you can't evaluate that data as it's coming in. What this allows you to do is to make changes to your program in reaction to your objective results. So if you're going through a string of objectives and hey, we're not quite meeting our how much change we set up in each objective, well, make changes now so that when you get to the end, you will be able to demonstrate effectiveness. So evaluating the results appears at the end of this model, but actually it occurs um, during and even prior to the development or the planning of the intervention. Okay, pre-planning process. So some key questions. Okay, and basically the idea is that you want to make sure that you have a clear picture of what it is you're going to be doing, right? So some of the things you need to kind of consider, right? How's the community defined, right? Basically, what's your target population? Your target population is basically a subgroup of a larger population that possess common characteristics, right? There's the more the characteristics you string along, the idea is that in order for an individual to become a part of your target population, they have to possess these characteristics, right? So maybe we're dealing with males aged 18 to 21 that currently vape, right? So a person would have to be a male aged between 18 and 21 and currently vape. Okay, that makes them part of your target population. This allows you to um, speak directly to your target population um, rather than kind of just speaking in general terms that may or may not apply to them. What are the desired health outcomes, right? What's your final destination? Does the community have the capacity and infrastructure to address the problem? Basically, it's resource. Do you have the resources available to carry out your plan? If not, you either need to think about how am I going to get those resources, or do I need to restructure my plan around what's available to me? Um, is policy change needed? Is policy change even something that's possible? Um, is it going to benefit what you're trying to do? Okay, is it intra or inter organizational? Is it from within the organization, or is it multiple organizations going to be contributing? The time frame. You absolutely have to know the time frame. Time is your most precious resource. Things have to occur between these two set points. That's all you have to work with. You need to make sure your plan can be delivered and implemented within those time frames. Deliverables, right? If you're working on a grant, okay, the grantee usually, typically, most cases, right, wants to see their return on investment. So they issue the grant to you. They want to see some form of evidence that those grant funds are producing something that's beneficial. And they may ask for you to submit deliverables illustrating or providing that evidence. Leadership and structure, right? The organization within your program, right? Who's calling the shots? Who's overseeing, what this group is doing? That all has to be established. Identifying and engaging partners. Again, one way to create more resources is to share resources, or identify organizations or individuals that are willing to share resources for the common good. So there's a lot of things to consider. These plans, you just don't want to jump into a situation with this idea that I'll figure it out as I go, or maybe just lightly consider the aspects of what the plan is going to entail. If you do it that way, my position is you're less likely to be successful than if you took all the steps necessary to develop this comprehensive plan.